Hello there. You're a feisty little one. Fit him with a restraining bolt.
Killing girl.
Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to the Galactic Archives. Tonight, we're spending our evening talking about emotional payoff, but in many ways, we're actually also talking about memory. We're talking about those moments and stories that make us put the book down for a minute, stare at the wall, and simply sit with what just happened. That actually happened to me earlier today with something else. The interesting thing is that those moments rarely just happen. A vow matters because of every choice that came before it. A confession between characters matters because of all the things left unsaid. A simple gesture, such as a hand offered, a chair pulled closer, or someone choosing to stay, can carry more emotional weight than an entire battle because the story has spent so long teaching us why those things actually matter. And I think that's one of the quiet joys of long-form storytelling. We spend chapters, sometimes years, building relationships one small piece at a time, and then eventually a scene arrives where all of those pieces suddenly click. Nothing new has really been created. Instead, something that has been true for a long time finally becomes visible to the reader. So tonight, we're going to spend some time in that space. We'll talk about how emotional release is earned, how bonds become visible through repetition and presence, and why the most meaningful vows in fiction, or any story, are often the ones characters have already been living long before they ever speak the words aloud. However you're joining us tonight, whether you're writing, drawing, folding laundry, which I should actually do later, or simply resting at the end of a long day, I'm glad you're here. All right. Funny. I was just talking about that. I have a bunch of laundry to fold later. It's been crazy hot up this way, so I have been doing everything that I can to stay cool and not become a puddle on the floor. Which unfortunately is not as easy as I would like it to be. All right. I'm going to be reading directly from my script this evening because apparently every time that there's a graphics driver update, I then have to rip out everything attached to the prompter and reinstall it from scratch, and I didn't feel like doing that. It takes too much work, so I didn't deal with that today. Instead, I'll be reading directly from the script. So, I'm glad that you're here, Daz. I'm glad that you've had a productive day, and hopefully you're taking an opportunity to just be still for a little while, because cleaning can be kind of exhausting. Alright. For it... the end of June, there was one. The very end of June, I'm pretty sure. Or close to it. I'd have to go look again. But yeah, it seems like every time that there's an update to my graphics card driver, it borks all the stuff with the prompter because it's all tied to that. So when I have some time, I have to go reinstall all of that stuff, and it's a process. So I didn't feel like dealing with that today. But outside of that, everything else seems to be functional this evening. Wow, suddenly losing my voice. Not cool. Alright. For those who may be joining us for the first time tonight, my name is Neshla. I'm a long-form storyteller and world builder, and these workshops are an opportunity for us to spend a little while thinking carefully about the stories, not only in terms of what happens within them, but in terms of why certain moments stay with us long after we finish reading. These workshop sessions are always meant to be quiet spaces. There's no pressure to speak in chat if you don't want to. There's no expectation that anyone has to participate directly, and no requirement that anyone has to arrive with answers prepared. There isn't really homework in the traditional sense. Some people listen while they write. Some people listen while they paint miniatures, sort laundry, work on projects, or simply rest at the end of a long day. However you happen to be joining us tonight, you're welcome. This evening, we're talking about emotional payoff, which may be one of the most difficult things to define in storytelling and one of the easiest to recognize when it actually succeeds. Most readers know that feeling instinctively. A scene arrives and something settles into place. A line of dialogue, my goodness. A line of dialogue suddenly carries more weight than its words alone should reasonably hold. A simple gesture becomes unexpectedly moving. Two characters sit together in silence, and somehow that silence feels larger than entire battles. We recognize these moments because they leave a particular kind of emotional residue. They linger. They follow us after the chapter ends, and they become the scenes that we return to years later when we think about why a story mattered to us in the first place. The difficulty, of course, is that emotional payoff is rarely created by the scene in which it finally appears. It's tempting to think of emotional release as a singular event. We often speak of confessions, reunions, declarations, and vows as though they were singular moments that generate emotion by their very existence. And yet, the scenes that affect us the most deeply are usually doing something very different. They are harvesting emotions that have been quietly growing for a long time. They are the visible appearance of seeds planted chapters, books, or sometimes even years earlier. By the time a reader reaches a meaningful confession or significant vow, the work that makes that moment possible has often already been done by the writer. This is one of the reasons that emotional scenes can be so difficult to write. Believe me, I know. I struggle even reading them on stream, if that should tell you anything. It's possible to construct a technically perfect declaration of love and still leave the readers unmoved emotionally. It's possible to stage an elaborate reunion and have it feel strangely hollow. And it's equally possible for a character to offer another person a blanket, ask whether they have eaten, or quietly take the first watch at the foot of the bed and create a scene that readers never forget. The difference rarely lies in the size of the gesture. More often, it lies in accumulated meaning. Readers are often moved not because a moment announces itself as being important, but because the story has patiently taught them why the moment matters when it happens. Chapters 24 to 27 of Steps into the Past occupy a particularly interesting place within Steps into the Past because they are chapters of release rather than conclusion. The larger story itself hasn't ended. The wider conflict hasn't disappeared. Responsibilities for the various characters remain. Questions remain, and threats definitely remain. Yet the narrative finally allows itself something that it has been denying its characters for quite some time. Space. There is enough safety for truths to be spoken. There's enough quiet for old promises to actually become visible, and enough stillness for people to look directly at one another and acknowledge what has existed beneath the surface for years. Stories can often change shape when characters are finally allowed to rest. During periods of crisis, people tend to focus on survival. They think in practical terms and they move from one immediate necessity to the next. They do what must be done because there is no room for anything else. Yet, we as human beings are not built solely for survival. Sooner or later, if the story allows it, people begin looking at one another. They begin noticing what's changed and begin recognizing what has also remained constant. They begin to understand what certain relationships have come to mean. In many narratives, some of the most profound emotional developments occur not during moments of danger, but during the first moments when danger briefly loosens its grip, which is what's happening during these chapters. Tonight, we're going to spend time talking about bonds and vows because both are fundamentally about continuity. A bond isn't usually created in a single scene. A vow isn't meaningful because it's spoken aloud. Both are built through repetition. They're constructed through presence, through choices made over and over, and through acts of care that gradually accumulate weight until they become inseparable from the relationship itself. The most powerful promises in fiction, or any story, are often the ones that characters have already been living long before they find the words. Oh, sorry. I am slouching. That's why I think vows are such fascinating pieces of narrative architecture. They're often mistaken for declarations when in reality they function more like revelations. The spoken vow matters because it makes something visible that was already existed in practice. The reader suddenly recognizes a pattern that has been there all along. A character may say, "I will remain," and the audience realizes that they've been remaining for many chapters. A character promises protection, and the reader understands that protection has already been shaping their actions for a very long time. The words matter, certainly, but they matter because they illuminate a truth that has already been earned. The same is true of emotional payoff itself. It's not manufactured at the moment that it happens. It is revealed. And I think this is one of the reasons that these chapters resonate so strongly with me as the writer and the narrator, and hopefully you as the reader. They are deeply interested in loyalty that has endured quietly for years. They're interested in the way that care can become habitual, almost invisible, until circumstances force people to finally acknowledge its existence. And they're interested in the idea that love is often less dramatic than stories sometimes portray. It can be patient and steady. It can exist in routines, in watchfulness, in staying when leaving would be easier. And sometimes the most meaningful relationships in fiction are not defined by grand declarations at all, but by the accumulation of 1,000 small choices that eventually become impossible to ignore. As writers, I think this invites us to ask a particularly important question. When we imagine emotional payoff in our own stories, are we thinking about the moment itself, or the long path that makes it actually possible? Are we planning the confession, or building the trust that makes the confession actually matter? Are we planning the vow, or are we building the years of loyalty that gives it its emotional weight? Those are the questions that sit quietly beneath our workshop tonight. Because these chapters are not really about romance alone, nor are they simply about declarations or promises. They're about recognition, and about the moment when people finally understand what's been true for much longer than they may have realized. They're about making relationships visible in ways that permanently alter the shape of the story going forward. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that emotional release is not the opposite of tension. Often it is the reward for carrying that tension honestly for a very long time. Tonight, we're going to spend some time in that space. We're going to look at how writers earn emotional release without slipping into melodrama, how intimacy can be layered patiently over the course of many chapters, and how vows can function not simply as memorable lines of dialogue, but as structural moments that reshape the entire relationships and sometimes entire stories. As we begin tonight, you may quietly think about a story that has stayed with you for years. When you remember its most emotional moment, do you remember the scene itself? Or do you remember all the small moments that made the scene possible? Alright. I know. That's weird, because it's telling me that we don't have an ad for another, 8 seconds. Twitch is lying to me. I will be right back. Wow, Frosty. That was a little harsh. Anyway, welcome back from the ad break, my friends. As always, I am glad you're here. Whether you're subscribed or not, I'm just glad you're hanging out with me this evening. Part 2 leads us into our primary case study. Chapters 24 to 27, When Love Stops Being Subtext. One of the most interesting things about emotional payoff is that readers often experience it as a sudden event, even though structurally it's rarely that. A confession appears to arrive all at once, a vow seems to emerge in a single conversation, and a relationship suddenly changes shape in the space of a few pages. Yet if we look closely at stories that handle emotional release particularly well, we often discover that the emotional climax itself is not creating anything new. Rather, it's illuminating something that has existed for a very long time. This is why certain scenes stay with us. The scene itself matters, certainly, but its power comes from recognition. The reader suddenly understands something that they've been feeling for chapters, or an entire story. The character suddenly understands something that they've been living for years. And because both recognition events occur together, the emotional release feels not only satisfying, but inevitable. Chapters 24 to 27 are deeply interested in that kind of inevitability. They're interested in relationships that have already been built, loyalties that have already been demonstrated, and promises that have already been lived long before they're ever spoken aloud. They are not chapters about the beginning of love. They are chapters about love becoming visible, and that distinction matters enormously for us tonight. Stories often portray emotional payoff as a dramatic transformation. Two people suddenly realize their feelings, a revelation can change everything, and a confession creates a relationship where none existed before. There is certainly a place for those kinds of stories, and many of them are wonderful. But there is another kind of emotional payoff that feels quieter and in many ways more enduring. It's the moment when characters realize that they have not been walking toward love at all. They've been living inside it for quite some time. The story simply hasn't paused long enough for anyone to recognize it for what it actually is. These chapters occupy that kind of space. They arrive after prolonged uncertainty, fear, and prolonged vigilance. They arrive after people have spent a great deal of time focusing on survival and responsibility. The immediate crises have not entirely disappeared, but there is enough stillness now for emotional truths to begin surfacing. And that stillness can change stories. When danger is immediate, people tend to focus on what must happen next. They do what needs to be done because there is no room for anything else. Fear can narrow perspective. Responsibility can also narrow perspective, as well as urgency. Stillness, instead, does the opposite. It allows people to notice and remember, and it allows them to ask questions that they've been avoiding because there was never enough time or safety to ask them before. In fiction, some of the most significant emotional developments happen precisely because the characters are finally permitted to stop moving. And these 4 chapters understand that rather beautifully. Give me just 1 second here. Oh goodness, sorry. I promise I did eye drops. Chapter 24. Safety creates truth. One observation I find myself returning to whenever I revisit chapter 24, which is what we read on Friday, is that emotional honesty often requires safety long before it requires courage. Stories often emphasize bravery in discussions of confession, declarations, and vulnerable conversations. We often talk about characters finding the strength to speak or finally gathering the courage to reveal what they feel. That courage certainly matters, but I think safety matters first. Human beings rarely reveal their deepest truths while they're actively trying to survive. They reveal them when survival briefly loosens its grip, and when someone sits beside them and stays. And they reveal them when they're no longer feeling entirely alone. The emotional conversations that occur in this chapter aren't happening because the characters suddenly became different people. They're happening because circumstances have finally created enough room for honesty to surface. The watch has quieted, the immediate danger has passed, the future remains uncertain, of course, but for the first time in quite a while, there's enough stillness for people to look directly at one another. And that stillness can become its own kind of narrative space. And into that space enters truth. What makes that chapter particularly effective is that it never treats emotional revelation as spectacle. There are no dramatic speeches intended to force emotion upon the reader. Instead, the chapter trusts accumulated history and previous scenes. It trusts years of demonstrated behavior. This is especially visible in Jared's unwavering presence. His loyalty isn't created in this chapter, but it is recognized in this chapter. The emotional weight of his choices comes from repetition. He's remained, he has watched, and he has protected for years. He's carried responsibility quietly and consistently for all of those years. By the time the truths begin to emerge in chapter 24, the reader isn't learning something new. The reader is finally beginning to understand the emotional significance of actions they've already witnessed time and again. This is one of the most valuable lessons that these chapters offer. Readers don't need to be surprised to be moved emotionally. In fact, some of the most powerful emotional moments occur because the reader already knows. The scene becomes satisfying because it confirms what has long been felt, but not spoken. The recognition replaces the surprise that the reader might feel. And the recognition often creates a deeper emotional resonance with the reader. Goodness, sorry. Chapter 25. The Weight of a Vow. I think stories sometimes misunderstand vows. We often, as writers, portray them as moments of declaration. A promise is spoken, and because it's been spoken, something instantly changes. Yet when we look at the vows that stay with us in fiction, we often discover that they work very differently. The vow matters because it reveals a pattern of behavior that's already existed. The words are important, but they're not the entire event. The history behind the words is what gives them the weight. Chapter 25 explores this rather beautifully. The emotional center of the chapter isn't simply that a promise is made. It lies in understanding what the promise costs and recognizing how long it has already been shaping the characters' lives. This is where vows become extraordinarily powerful pieces of narrative architecture. A vow is, in many ways, a form of continuity. It reaches backward into the story and gathers everything that came before it. Every act of care, every sacrifice, every decision to remain, and every act of quiet loyalty. The spoken promise suddenly illuminates all of those moments simultaneously, and the reader realizes that the vow didn't begin here. It's been unfolding for chapters and perhaps across years. The realization triggers an emotional release by reorganizing the reader's understanding of the story. Previous scenes may acquire new meaning. Small moments become larger and quiet gestures become more profound. The relationship between the characters changes shape because the reader's perspective changes. That's extraordinarily difficult to achieve as a writer, believe me, I know. And yet when it works, it can feel effortless. The reader can simply think, of course this is what those moments meant. Of course this is who these people have become to one another. The inevitability is what makes it beautiful. Chapter 26. Love under the weight of responsibility. One of the things I appreciate most about these chapters is their refusal to isolate emotional development from the character's external reality. Love doesn't suddenly exist in a world without responsibility. Relationships don't emerge in a vacuum. People still carry duties, they still have obligations, and they still live inside the larger story. Chapter 26 explores this tension by allowing emotional truths to coexist with the practical realities rather than replacing or supplanting them. This is where the shifts involving Ethan and Callista become particularly compelling. Their relationship is not treated as an interruption to the larger narrative. It becomes another lens through which the larger narrative is experienced by the reader. This is an important distinction because stories sometimes separate emotional and practical concerns too rigidly. Plot happens in one place and relationships happen in another. But life rarely works that way, as I'm sure we know. Human beings carry emotional realities into every responsibility they have. A commander doesn't stop loving people because strategic decisions must be made. A healer doesn't stop worrying because larger concerns are emerging. And relationships don't cease to exist simply because the future becomes uncertain. If anything, uncertainty often makes those relationships more visible. Chapter 26 allows these realities to coexist. The result with that is that intimacy feels grounded and lived. It feels like something has emerged naturally from years of shared experiences rather than being imposed upon the story from outside. This may actually be one of the reasons these emotional developments feel so satisfying. The relationships aren't replacing the larger narrative, they're becoming inseparable from it. And honestly, if you guys had seen like the original version of these chapters, you would understand why I'm just like mind blown. It's crazy when I compare the original version of these chapters to how they are now. It's insane. Like I actually sat down recently with the original version of one of these chapters almost side by side with the current version and was like, wow, okay. So for instance, chapter 24 it's a huge change because I've been spending so much time really digging into like the emotional texture of the scenes, not necessarily just what happens in the chapter, but like the emotional texture of each of the scenes. And it's really, as I'm going through and editing and expanding these, it's hitting me in the feels. Seriously. And like honestly, if you looked at the original version versus the current version, I think you would understand. Oh. Chapter 27. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes, just as a heads up. Chapter 27. The vow that reshapes the arc. There are moments in long-form storytelling when an emotional revelation changes the shape of everything that follows, not because the plot suddenly transforms, but because the reader's understanding is what changes. Chapter 27 contains one of those moments. By this point in the story has accumulated an enormous amount of emotional history. The reader has witnessed recovery, fear, responsibility, grief, loyalty, and endurance. Relationships have been tested repeatedly. Characters have remained beside one another through circumstances that would have broken many other bonds. Sorry. And eventually, all that accumulated history reaches a point of recognition. This is where vows become transformative, not because they can magically solve problems or end conflict, but because they create a new emotional reality moving forward. After certain truths are spoken, relationships can't return to their previous state. The future remains uncertain. Danger may still exist. and responsibilities for the various characters may still demand them, that they make difficult choices. But something fundamental has shifted. The characters understand one another differently. The reader understands them differently, certainly. The emotional landscape of the story has changed. This is why vows often feel larger than the individual scenes that they are revealed within. They don't merely conclude emotional arcs, they create new foundations. Everything that follows must now exist in conversation with this new understanding. The story moves forward carrying a different emotional shape than it had before. That's what makes these chapters such an extraordinary study in emotional payoff. They understand that the emotional release is not an ending. It is instead a transformation. Love becomes visible, promises become explicit, and loyalty is recognized. And because these things have been patiently earned over the course of many chapters, the emotional release feels less like a sudden event and more like a truth finally stepping into the light. The reader isn't being told how to feel or what to feel, they're being invited to recognize it. And recognition, perhaps more than any other emotion in storytelling, lingers. As you think about your own stories, you might quietly consider whether your most important emotional moments are creating something entirely new, or whether they're revealing truths that have been present in the story all along. Sometimes the most powerful payoff in fiction is not surprise, but the recognition of things that have been there the whole time. We have an ad starting in about a minute and a half. Okay. Give me one sec. Heart. Well, you know what? I'm gonna actually not start the next section until after the ad, because I'm probably gonna get like 2 sentences in. Maybe 3. So, we have about a minute before the ad break starts. If anybody has any questions, comments, jokes in chat, please feel free. I'm gonna get some more water while I'm thinking about it. And these prompts can also apply to stories that you've read. It's a story that stuck with you for a particularly long time. I was just talking to a friend earlier about the stories that have kind of stuck with us over the years. And for me, it's things like Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series and David Weber's Honor Harrington series. If you haven't read either one, I highly recommend them. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we come back from our ad break, which is starting right about now. Get yourself some water. Alright, Frosty Tools. Ocular Rebellion? That's a new one. I approve. Yes, Ocular Rebellion is totally a thing. If you spend a lot of time staring at a screen and reading, like I tend to do during story time and workshops, they are your friends. And I highly recommend that if you stream any kinds of anything like that, or spend a lot of time reading or staring at a screen, you should keep some nearby. I have boxes of them because I can't survive without them during story time or workshop streams. Also, for anybody who's ever made comments about my snacking habits on stream, you'll be pleased to know that I actually have blueberries. See? I'm being good. I'm staying away from candy for the most part today. But yes. So right before we were rudely interrupted by that ad, I was talking about Anne McCaffrey, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series. I actually grew up reading that series. I don't think I've actually read them all. They are excellent, kind of sci-fi fantasy. And now that I think about it, it's a lot of the like societal stuff for the Katani is loosely based on some of that. At least a little bit. You know, I can definitely see some parallels now that I'm thinking about it. But also, more importantly, all of the like military structure for the Katani Navy and Marines pulls a lot of inspiration from David Weber's Honor Harrington series. It is military sci-fi. If you have not read it, highly recommend it. He also has lots of other series that are also very good. Historical fiction and things like that. I haven't read a lot of those, but I do know that they're very good. Oh my goodness. My words, sorry. Apparently I need water or something, but yeah. Alright. I'm actually not familiar with that one, but now I'm curious. You'll have to send me the name and author on Discord later so I can look her up. I'm always looking for new things to read. But if you like military sci-fi, definitely check them out. What? Frosty Jules being a little random. Alright, I see how it is. Part 3. Secondary examples. Emotional payoff as accumulated memory. We touched on this a little bit previously. One of the most useful ways to think about emotional payoff in a story is to imagine it not as a climax, but as accumulated memory finally becoming available to the reader all at once. A single scene may appear to contain the emotional release, but the scene itself is usually only the visible surface of something much older in the story. This feeling comes from memory pressing upward through the moment. It comes from the reader remembering earlier scenes, whether consciously or not, and recognizing that the present scene has become a gathering place for everything that came before. This is why emotional payoff can feel so disproportionate to the action on the page that's happening at the time. A hand clasp, like the warrior's forearm grip, can feel larger than a speech because the hand has been withheld, offered, studied, or searched for across many earlier moments in the story. A shared breath can feel larger than a battle because the story has taught the reader what it means for these particular people to be quiet, together. And a vow can reshape an entire arc because it doesn't begin with the words spoken in the scene. It begins with every prior choice that made those words believable. This is where chapters 24 through 27 benefit from the broader architecture of steps into the past. The emotional release in these chapters doesn't stand alone. It's built on the long memories of Bestine, Druckenwell, Tanagus, Catan, the Praxium years, Marin's earlier trials, rescues, recoveries, and all of the smaller moments where loyalty had to be demonstrated before it could safely be named. When Jared remains beside Marin here, the reader isn't encountering a sudden romantic gesture. The reader sees the continuation of a pattern already established by absence, restraint, concern, and return. When Ethan and Callista find themselves shifting toward one another in the quiet corridors and half-lit rooms of the estate, the story is not introducing emotional intimacy out of nowhere. It's allowing long companionship, shared fear, shared responsibility, and years of trust to finally become more visible. That's the great strength of long-form emotional writing. The story can allow a present scene to carry more than its present circumstances because the reader has been taught how much history lives inside that moment. Yeah, and if you have been here since the beginning, when I started reading Marin's arc, which I will eventually go back and edit all of those, but yes, if you have been here since the beginning and you are finally to the point in chapter 24 of Section of the Past, and we're talking about this right now, you will begin to understand what I'm talking about. Because if you're familiar with Marin's arc, you'll see that kind of emotional payoff, really, really building throughout the story. Earlier wounds as later meaning. One of the strongest secondary examples for this workshop in particular is the way that earlier wounds become later meaning in the story. Stories sometimes treat suffering as something that exists only in the moment when it actually occurs. A character is hurt, a crisis unfolds, the scene resolves, and the narrative moves on to the next event. Yet emotional payoff often depends on the story refusing to move on too quickly. Earlier pain must continue to matter, not in a repetitive or exploitative way, but as part of the emotional reality the characters carry into later scenes. When a later moment of tenderness arrives, it has power because the reader remembers what that tenderness is answering. When someone stays beside a bed, the gesture matters more because the reader remembers the time that person couldn't be there. When a vow is spoken, it matters more because the reader understands the long history of fear, protection, and grief that made such a promise necessary in the first place. This is particularly important in the relationship between Jared and Marin specifically. Their bond isn't made meaningful by their love for one another. Instead, it's made meaningful by the fact that their love has been shaped by circumstances that repeatedly required restraint. Jared's loyalty hasn't always taken the form that he might have wanted. There are times when protection required distance, silence, or absence rather than visible closeness. That kind of emotional structure can be difficult to write because readers need to understand that restraint is not indifference. The story has to teach them how to read the absence as a burden rather than abandonment, and how to read silence as discipline rather than a lack of feeling, and how to read watchfulness as a form of devotion. By the time the vow becomes a spoken truth, the emotional release comes partly from the reader finally being allowed to connect those earlier forms of restraint to the love that actually motivated them. This is also why emotional payoff often benefits from complication. A perfectly simple relationship may be comforting, but it rarely creates the same kind of emotional release as one that has required endurance, misunderstanding, distance, uncertainty, or even sacrifice. The complication doesn't need to be melodramatic, and it doesn't need to be built on artificial conflict or withheld communication for its own sake. It simply needs to reflect the reality that meaningful bonds often develop under pressure. Love that has had to survive difficult circumstances carries a different texture than love that has never been tested. Vows that emerge after hardship feel different from vows spoken before anyone knows what they actually cost. Chapters 24 through 27 draw strength from that cost, not by dwelling on pain for spectacle, but by allowing tenderness to appear as an answer to what has already been endured. Alright, I'm slouching. Alright. There we go. Ethan and Callista as a study in mature intimacy. Ethan and Callista here provide a particularly useful secondary example because their emotional movement operates differently from Jared and Marin's. Jared and Marin are dealing with a vow that has spanned years of youth, secrecy, identity, and danger. Their emotional arc has the quality of something long held finally becoming visible. Ethan and Callista, by contrast, carry the weight of mature intimacy, shared history, and practical partnership. Their connection is not framed as a sudden discovery. It is framed instead as the deepening of something already trusted. That makes their scenes especially valuable from a craft perspective because mature intimacy requires a different kind of pacing than a first confession. It often lives less in shock and more in recognition, less in uncertainty and more in the quiet courage of allowing a familiar bond to shift, which we talked about earlier. The danger when writing mature intimacy like this is that it can easily be flattened into comfort. Comfort isn't a problem, but comfort by itself may not create any narrative movement. What gives Ethan and Callista's shifts emotional weight is that their bond is comfortable, yet still changing. They know one another well enough for silence to carry meaning, but that familiarity doesn't prevent vulnerability from appearing. In fact, that familiarity makes vulnerability more precise. Callista knows when Ethan carries too much because she has watched him do so before. Ethan trusts her presence because she has been a stabilizing force across years of crisis, recovery, and command. Their intimacy is layered because it isn't built solely on discovery. It's built on practiced recognition. They don't need to explain themselves fully to one another before comfort can function. Yet the story still allows them to reach new emotional ground. That balance is worth studying because many writers unintentionally treat established relationships as narratively static. Once two characters know one another well, the story assumes the emotional work is complete. Yet long relationships continue to change. Shared history can deepen conflict as easily as it deepens comfort. Familiarity can make certain truths easier to speak and others more difficult. A person may trust someone completely and still not know how to let them carry a particular burden. Ethan and Callista's scenes work because they don't treat intimacy as a solved condition. They treat it as an ongoing practice. The emotional payoff comes from not discovering that they care, but from seeing how care adapts when the weight between them changes. We have an ad starting in just under 5 minutes, my friends. Jared's loyalty and the shape of presence. Jared's loyalty offers another important comparison because it demonstrates how presence can become one of the most powerful forms of emotional architecture in a long-form story. Presence is easy to underestimate because it is often a quiet thing. It may not generate the obvious drama of argument, rescue, confession, or sacrifice, yet repeated presence conditions the reader to trust a relationship. When a character remains through difficult scenes, returns after separation, notices small changes, guards rest, or offers help without demanding recognition, the story is building a pattern of emotional reliability. Over time, that pattern becomes meaningful enough that the character's presence itself begins to carry weight before they say or do anything dramatic. This is why Jared's vow can function so strongly. His vow is not an isolated promise. It gives language to the pattern the reader has already been watching. He's been living the vow before even naming it to Marin. He's been making choices shaped by it before Marin fully understands them. And he's been carrying love as discipline, loyalty as restraint, and protection as something more complicated than simply being close. When he finally speaks from that place, the words don't feel like ornamentation. They feel like a key turning in a lock. The story has been quietly building for a long time. The reader's response is not only to the words themselves, but to the sudden coherence that they give to earlier scenes. For writers, and for those of us who read, this is a powerful reminder that loyalty becomes convincing through structure. It's not enough for a character to say that they will stay. The story has to show what staying looks like when it's inconvenient, painful, frightening, or unglamorous. Staying may mean keeping watch while exhausted. It may mean stepping back when another person needs space. It may mean accepting that protection sometimes requires trust rather than control. And it might mean remaining emotionally available even when there is nothing dramatic to do. By the time that a vow is spoken, readers should be able to look backwards in the story and see the vow already present in the character's behavior. That backwards recognition is what creates the emotional payoff. Vows as structural turning points. It can be helpful to think of vows not as dialogue, but instead as structural turning points. A vow changes the story because it changes the terms under which future scenes will be read. Once a promise has been spoken, the audience carries it forward. Every later decision exists in relation to that. Every future danger tests it. Every moment of separation, return, fear, or comfort becomes shaped by what the characters have declared or finally admitted. In that sense, a vow is not an ending. It is a new narrative pressure. It creates an expectation, it creates responsibility, and it creates a standard against which future behavior will be measured. We talked about narrative pressure before. This is one reason that vows can reshape an arc so powerfully. They do not simply express feelings, they organize future meaning in the story. A character who has sworn to remain can no longer leave without that action carrying new significance. A character who has promised protection must now navigate the limits of that. A character who has accepted love must now live inside the vulnerability of being loved. The vow opens emotional territory rather than closing it. That is one of the most important distinctions writers can make when handling emotional payoff. Payoff doesn't have to mean resolution. Sometimes it means transformation. The old emotional question has been answered, and because it has, a new question becomes possible. And I'm going to stop there because we have an ad starting in less than 10 seconds. Please go get yourself some water, my friends. Have a stretch. Grab a snack. I will be right back. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. I do hope you actually took the opportunity to get some water, grab a snack, have a stretch. And also, if you see me slouching, doing weird things, squinting, please tell me so that I can take care of that, because I'm notorious for that. That's what the commands are there for. There are both some exclamation point commands and some channel point commands. Please feel free to use them. That's why they exist. And for anybody who is lurking in the background and listening, you are more than welcome to be here. That's kind of why the streams here are set up the way that they are. As always, you're not expected to talk in chat, but you are welcome to do so. And if you can definitely feel free to play with the commands. You can ask questions in chat. Whatever strikes your fancy this evening. In chapters 24 through 27, this distinction matters because the story doesn't end. The larger conflict still exists. The dangers surrounding Tanagas haven't vanished. The emotional release doesn't erase the external pressure. Instead, it changes how the characters will carry that pressure. The vow becomes part of the story's future architecture. Love becomes not a retreat from conflict, but a new way of enduring it. This is one of the reasons emotional payoff can be so satisfying without feeling final. The reader is given emotional release, but not closure, in the sense that everything is finished. The bond has changed, the story continues, and the emotional landscape has been permanently altered. Ooh. Avoiding melodrama through specificity, or being specific. Sorry, that it's a word. I promise you it is. It's just a mouthful. Another useful secondary craft lesson is how specificity helps emotional release and avoids melodrama. Melodrama can often arise when the emotion expressed in the scene exceeds what the scene's grounding can support. The character says something enormous, but the scene hasn't provided enough specific texture to make the enormity feel lived. The result can feel performative, even if the emotion is sincere within the story. Specificity prevents this by anchoring emotional release in concrete behavior, shared history, physical details, and relational truths. A vow becomes stronger when it is tied to a particular memory. A confession becomes more moving when it emerges from a specific pattern of care or behavior. A moment of intimacy becomes more believable when it includes the awkward, practical, human details of bodies, rooms, exhaustion, food, warmth, breath, and touch. These chapters are strongest when emotional release remains attached to lived details. The bed, the quilt, the Marin's tags, the watch at the door, the food, her exhaustion, the breathwork, and the careful assistance, and the refusal to crowd someone who is still recovering, along with the quiet humor that appears even after pain, all help to keep the emotions grounded. These details matter because they prevent the scene from floating into abstraction. Thank you, Riff. Yes, all the hydration. Yes, if you spend a lot of time when you're streaming, reading, talking, or any of the above, your vocal cords will thank you. Hi, Sin! Good to see you, my friend. Could I get a shout out for Sin God, please? He is a member of the Survivor Squad and a fellow streamer. You sure? Reports of your death have not been exaggerated? I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It's good to see you. It's been a while. Good to see you around. Hey, that's totally okay. We all have a lot going on. Like I said, lurkers are welcome. There is no expectation that you need to talk in chat, but it's always nice when you do. So, good to see you. The characters are not simply declaring love inside an emotional void. They are tired, they're wounded, they're being watched over, and they're hungry. They're still living inside a house preparing for danger. The intimacy is powerful because it exists inside real conditions rather than separate from them. This is a lesson that applies across genres. Emotional payoff rarely needs to be amplified by removing ordinary details. Often, the ordinary detail is what allows the payoff to become larger and more impactful. The cup of water matters. The blanket matters. The chair beside the bed matters. And the person keeping watch outside the door definitely matters. The practical tenderness matters as well. These things help remind the readers that love isn't merely something the characters say. It's something that appears in the management of real vulnerability. It's something that knows when someone needs food, sleep, help sitting upright, or the dignity of being allowed to try before assistance is offered. Those specifics are not distractions from emotional release. They are the vessel that allows emotional release to hold its shape. Oh, gosh. Did I not fix that? Hold on. Oh, my word. You are correct. Category is being dumb. That is very weird. Should be fixed now? I think. There we go. Thanks. I didn't realize that went poof. I thought I had fixed that at last stream, but it should be fixed now. Thanks. I will have to remember to check that next time. One more thing on my list of stuff. But hey, it's cool. Thanks for that. I was like, why do I not have a category? What? Oops. It's fixed. It wouldn't be an archive stream without at least something being weird. It's all good. Yeah, I've noticed that it does that sometimes, even when I set it. It's very weird. Jeez, yeah. Yeah, precisely. That would be bad. Emotional release without ending the story. Ooh. Perhaps the most important comparison for us to carry forward is the idea that emotional release doesn't need to end the tension. In fact, in long-form storytelling, some of the most powerful emotional payoffs occur while larger tension actually remains unresolved. This can seem counterintuitive at first. Writers sometimes worry that allowing characters to confess love, speak vows, or find moments of deep intimacy too early will reduce narrative momentum. They fear that once the emotional question has been answered, the story will lose its forward energy. That can happen if the relationship was the only active source of tension. But when a story has carefully layered its conflicts, emotional payoff doesn't drain that momentum. It changes the nature of it. Once a bond becomes visible, the story gains new possibilities. The characters now have something named that can be protected, tested, strengthened, misunderstood, or relied upon. The emotional release becomes a foundation rather than a conclusion. In chapters 24 through 27, this is especially important because the wider conflict continues pressing at the edges. The vows and bonds don't remove the danger. They alter the emotional terms under which the danger will be faced. That makes the payoff feel meaningful without making the story feel finished. The reader finds relief in the recognition, but the narrative still has somewhere to go. This is one of the great strengths of writing emotional payoff in the middle or later middle portions of a long arc. It allows the story to stop treating love, loyalty, or trust as questions and begin treating them as active forces within the story. Once a vow is spoken and accepted, the question is no longer whether the bond exists. The question then becomes what the bond will do within the story. How will it shape decisions? How will it withstand pressure? How will it change the way the characters interpret danger, duty, distance, and recovery? That shift can create powerful forward momentum because the story has not yet reached the end of its emotional arc. It has changed its operating conditions, as Greer might say. Yeah. Greer is one of many characters that lives in my brain rent-free. He has taken up full residence. For those who are wondering about the overall arc of Steps into the Past, chapter 24, which is the chapter that we read on Friday, is 8 chapters before the end of the story. However, the end of the story does not mean the end of Marin's story. It's far from it, actually. You'll understand what I mean when we get to the next story, which I need to finish writing. The larger arc as emotional witness. What makes these chapters resonate beyond their immediate scenes is that the broader arc functions almost like a witness. The story has watched these characters become who they are to one another. It has watched them fall and fail, endure, withdraw, return, protect, misunderstand, and remain. By the time emotional truths are spoken aloud in these chapters, the narrative itself seems to understand the weight of what is happening. That may sound abstract, but it's something that readers often feel. A well-built emotional payoff carries the authority of the story behind it. The moment doesn't need to argue for its own importance because the entire arc has already testified on its behalf. Ooh, handwriting letters? I haven't handwritten a letter in a really long time. Talk about being old school. Alright. This is why the strongest emotional payoffs often feel quiet rather than loud. The story doesn't need to strain for effect. It's already done the work. The reader arrives carrying the necessary context from previous chapters. The characters arrive carrying the necessary history, and the scene can therefore afford restraint. It can let a simple line land, it can let silence remain, and it can trust a touch, a breath, or shared memory to carry meaning because the foundation is already in place. Ooh. That is actually really good and definitely something that should be celebrated. That's cool. That's a really good way to celebrate something like that. In many ways, restraint becomes possible only when the story has earned it. Without the groundwork, restraint may feel underwritten, and with the groundwork present, restraint can become quietly devastating. That's the craft lesson I would most want to carry from these secondary examples. Emotional payoff isn't created by pressing harder in the payoff scene. It's created by preparing the reader to feel more with less. The richer the accumulated history, the less the final moment needs to actually perform. The more clearly that love has been lived, the fewer words are required when love is finally spoken aloud. And the more faithfully a vow has been enacted, the more powerful it becomes when it is named. This is the quiet strength of chapters 24 through 27, and it's a lesson that applies to any story where bonds, promises, and emotional recognition are meant to matter. As you think about your own stories, or one that you've read, you might quietly consider whether your most important emotional payoff has enough memory beneath it. What small repeated actions, absences, gestures, or choices might help the reader feel that the moment was not created suddenly, but revealed after being present all along? We have an ad starting at about 2 minutes and 36 seconds. Part 4. Applied Craft. One of the most useful shifts a writer can make... building emotional payoff before the payoff scene. There we go. One of the most useful shifts a writer can make when thinking about emotional payoff in a story is to stop treating the payoff scene as the place where the emotion is actually created. The scene where the confession happens, where the vow is spoken, and where the bond is finally acknowledged, or where the characters allow themselves to rest in one another's presence is certainly important. Still, it is rarely the place where the emotional power begins in the story. More often, the payoff scene is where accumulated meaning actually becomes visible. It's the place where prior choices, silences, gestures, absences, and acts of care finally gather into a form the reader can recognize all at once. When a payoff scene feels hollow, the problem isn't always that the scene itself needs more intensity. Sometimes the problem is that the story hasn't yet built enough memory beneath it for the intensity of the scene to feel earned. This is why emotional payoff benefits from patience. Writers often feel the pull toward the moment they are excited to write, especially when that moment involves confession, intimacy, reunion, or release. We can see the scene clearly before the draft has fully earned it. We know the line we want the characters to say. We know the gestures that will matter, and we know the vow that will change everything. The difficulty is that the readers can't feel the significance of that moment simply because the writer knows that it is significant. The readers have to be taught slowly and carefully what that moment actually means. They have to see the relationship under pressure. They have to recognize the pattern before it is named. And they have to understand what was withheld, what was endured, and what was chosen again and again before the words finally arrive. Okay. I'm going to actually pause right there because we have an ad starting in like 12 seconds. Please take this minute and a half to go get yourself some water, a snack, a stretch, or whatever else works for you in a minute and a half. See you soon. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. At least I think it ended. It's hard to tell sometimes. For writers, this means that the work of emotional payoff begins much earlier than the obvious scene. It begins with the small exchanges that may not appear important at first. It begins when one character notices another's exhaustion before anyone else does. It begins when someone adjusts their route to remain nearby without drawing attention to that choice. And it begins when a character doesn't speak, not because they feel nothing, but because speech would make the moment less safe. It begins in practical care, in repeated concern, in watchfulness, and in the slow construction of trust. By the time a vow is spoken, the reader should be able to look backward and see that the vow was already present in the character's behavior. The spoken promise shouldn't replace the pattern. It should instead reveal it. Writing emotional release without melodrama. One reason emotional release can tip into melodrama is that the scene tries to generate more emotion than it can support. Oop, sorry. Did I miss something? I think I did miss something. Hold on. Hold on 1 second. Hold on. Yep, okay. Yeah, I feel like something. Okay. Oh, I got lost. Hold on. Okay. Oh. There we go. No, okay, yeah. I got super lost. Here we go. Oh goodness. Ah. There we go. Somehow I got a little bit back up into part 3. But here we are. Sorry about that. Writing emotional release without melodrama. One reason emotional release can tip into melodrama is that the scene tries to generate more emotion that its foundation can support. This often happens when the writing leans heavily on declarations, heightened languages. Sorry. Sorry. Oh, dear. Okay. Heightened language, tears, dramatic pauses, or repeated assertions of importance without giving the reader enough specific relational evidence to carry the moment. The emotion itself may be sincere within the story, but sincerity alone doesn't always create believability. The readers need context and texture. They need the scene to remain attached to bodies, rooms, histories, and consequences. Without that grounding, emotional release can begin to feel like performance. Oh, hold on. I feel like I totally lost my spot. Hold on. I feel like I totally lost my spot. Okay. Ow. I apologize. I completely lost my spot. Okay. Yeah, you know what? I'm just going to start there. The way to avoid melodrama is not to reduce the emotion, it's to make the emotion more specific. A scene does not become more honest by being less intense. It becomes more honest when intensity is carried through details that belong only to these characters in this specific situation. Okay. A vow spoken beside a bed, carved by a father's hands, carries a different weight than the same vow spoken in a featureless room. A confession offered while one character is helping another drink water has a different texture than when delivered in an abstract emotional void. Practical care can make intense emotions feel believable because it reminds the reader that love is not just a feeling. It's attention, it's timing, and it's knowing when to speak and when to let someone breathe. It's about understanding what help can be offered without taking away the character's dignity. This is particularly useful when writing scenes of intimacy after trauma, grief, or prolonged strain. The goal here is not to make the emotional release smaller, but to let it emerge through forms that the characters can realistically bear. People who have spent chapters surviving may not suddenly speak in perfect emotional monologues. They may reach for familiar objects, they may ask small practical questions, and they may use humor to steady themselves. They might confess something enormous in language that remains plain because complex speech would feel false. The writer's task is to honor the emotional truth of the scene and of the moment without forcing the characters into a performance that doesn't belong to them. When the scene remains specific to the people inside it, emotional release becomes more powerful because it feels discovered rather than staged. Okay. Layering intimacy through repetition. Intimacy in fiction often becomes convincing through repetition rather than expansive explanation. A writer can tell the reader that two characters trust each other, but the reader begins to believe that trust when they see it enacted in small, recurring ways. Have a good night, Daz! One character waits before touching because they know the other needs their space. One character brings food because they understand exhaustion better than anyone else in the room, and yet another character notices a shift in breathing and responds without needing to ask. One character remains outside the door because their role is not to intrude, but to guard the privacy that allows the healing to actually occur. Over time, these patterns become a private language between the characters and the reader. This kind of repetition is powerful because it trains emotional recognition. The first time a gesture appears, it may simply read as care. The second time, it might become more familiar, and the third, the reader begins to anticipate its meaning. Eventually, the gesture carries significance before the narration explains anything. This is where emotional craft begins overlapping with the structure of the story. Repetition turns behavior into a language of its own. Variation keeps the language alive. If the same gesture appears in different emotional contexts, the reader begins to understand not only what the gesture generally means, but how its meaning shifts depending on the moment. A hand held during fear is not the same as a hand held during relief. A watch kept during a crisis is not the same as a watch kept during rest. The pattern remains recognizable, but the emotional temperature changes. This is also something that I've begun to realize with the veil code that I've been developing. So there's specific signals that mean specific things. Well, each one has a set definition, but based on the scene context that's, that it's occurring in, and like the people around, and like what's actually going on for them, the meaning of each individual veil signal can actually change slightly. For writers, the useful question here is not simply what intimate moment the scene contains, but what repeated behavior has actually prepared the reader to understand it. If the payoff scene depends on a bond, the draft should contain evidence of that bond long before the scene arrives. This evidence doesn't need to be loud. In fact, quieter evidence is often more effective for the reader because it allows intimacy to feel lived in rather than announced suddenly. The strongest bonds often appear in the way characters manage ordinary vulnerability. They know who needs quiet. They know who resists help. They know when humor will soften a difficult moment and when it would be a deflection. And they know which promises can be spoken directly and which must first be lived in silence. This is the material from which believable emotional payoff is built. Understanding vows as behavior. One of the most important craft principles for this workshop is that a vow should not begin with a sentence that states it. A vow should begin with the behavior. If a character promises to remain, the story should have already shown what that remaining costs. If a character promises protection, the story should already have demonstrated the limits and complications of that protection. And if a character promises love, the reader should already have seen the many forms that love has taken before it found language. This doesn't mean that every vow must be predictable. It means that the vow should feel like the natural naming of something the story has been steadily revealing. This approach doesn't change the function of these scenes. Instead of asking the vow to create the relationship, the writer asks the vow to clarify it. The spoken words become a lens through which the reader can reinterpret earlier behavior. Moments that once seemed merely kind become acts of devotion. Absences that once seemed painful become evidence of restraint. And watchfulness that once seemed practical becomes emotional commitment. This retroactive illumination is one of the great pleasures of long-form storytelling. The vow reaches backward as well as forward in the story. It gathers the past into coherence and then sets new expectations for the future of the story. The forward movement matters just as much as the backward recognition. A vow that changes nothing after it is spoken may feel beautiful in the moment, but structurally weightless afterward. Once a character has sworn something, the story has created a new emotional condition. Future choices will now be read in relation to that promise. Future failures will hurt differently, and future separations will carry different tension. Future acts of care will feel like continuations rather than an isolated kindness. This is why vows are not endings. They are instead foundations. They give the story a new emotional architecture that later scenes can test, deepen, complicate, and honor. Hello to Sniper. letting payoff change the story without ending it. A common fear among writers is that emotional payoff will reduce the tension if it arrives before the final ending. There is a worry that once characters confess love, name a bond, make a vow, forgive one another, or reach some important emotional understanding, the story will lose one of its engines. The fear is understandable, especially in stories where unresolved emotional tension has driven much of the narrative momentum. Yet emotional payoff doesn't have to end the tension. When handled well, it changes the nature of the tension by transforming uncertainty into commitment. Before that payoff, the story may ask whether the bond exists, whether the trust will hold, whether the characters can admit their feelings, or whether a promise can finally be spoken. After the payoff, those questions often shift. The story begins asking what the bond will require, how trust will function under the new pressure, what the vow may cost, and how love will shape decisions in a world that remains dangerous. This can be an incredibly powerful transition because it allows the relationship to become active rather than merely anticipated. The payoff gives the character something solid to carry into future conflict, so the emotional release doesn't undermine the narrative momentum. It instead redirects it. This isn't particularly valuable in long-form stories because relationships can't remain suspended in unresolved tension forever without beginning to feel artificial. Eventually, the story must allow certain truths to become known. When that happens, the writer gains access to a new stage of intimacy. Characters who know where they stand with one another can still disagree, fear, misunderstand, grieve, protect, and make mistakes. The difference is that the emotional ground beneath those conflicts has changed. The story is no longer powered by whether love exists, it is powered by what the love actually does. And I'm actually going to pause there because we have an ad starting in like 15 seconds. Oh. I hope you guys are having an awesome evening so far. Please take this break to go get some water, grab a snack, take your meds if you need those. I will be right back. Welcome back from the ad break, my friends. Sorry, apparently words are hard today. Alright. Hopefully now I won't lose my place. That'd be cool. Common pitfalls in emotional payoff. One of the most common pitfalls in writing emotional payoff is confusing intensity with depth. A scene may contain tears, declarations, physical closeness, and elevated language without actually feeling deep if the emotion isn't grounded in the relationship history. Depth emerges from context. It emerges from accumulated meaning, and it emerges when the reader understands what this moment answers, what it costs, and why it couldn't have happened earlier in the story. Without the context, even a beautifully written emotional scene may feel untethered to the rest of the story. Another common pitfall is resolving too much too quickly. Emotional release can be deeply satisfying, but if the scene immediately dissolves every tension surrounding the relationship, the aftermath may feel strangely flat. Real emotional breakthroughs often create new vulnerabilities for the characters. Naming a bond doesn't eliminate fear, making a vow doesn't erase danger, and accepting love doesn't automatically resolve trauma, grief, duty, or uncertainty. In many cases, the most interesting storytelling begins after the emotional truth has been spoken, because the characters must now learn how to live with that new truth. Writers can preserve the momentum by allowing the payoff to transform the conflict rather than erase it. A quieter pitfall involves making the emotional moment too polished. Characters under strain may not articulate themselves perfectly. They may circle the truth. They may speak plainly because anything more elaborate would feel unbearable. They may joke, hesitate, touch an object, look away, or ask a practical question that carries far more emotional meaning than a grand confession ever could. Allowing imperfection into emotional payoff often makes it more believable. The goal isn't to write the most beautiful possible speech. The goal is to write the moment when these specific people are capable of having an honest moment. Adapting these techniques across genres. Although tonight's workshop is grounded and steps into the past, the principles can apply across nearly every genre. In fantasy, vows may carry ritual, magic, lineage, or political consequence, but they still become powerful because the reader understands the personal cost behind them. In romance, emotional payoff often depends on the careful accumulation of trust, attraction, vulnerability, and choice. In mystery or thriller narratives, a vow may be less about love and more about loyalty, justice, or refusing to abandon the truth. In horror, emotional payoff may appear in a character choosing to remain with someone in the dark, not because survival is guaranteed, but because abandonment has become unthinkable. Even stories without explicit vows still contain vow-like structures. A mentor repeatedly showing up for a student can become a vow. A sibling protecting another sibling across years of hardship can become a vow. And a community rebuilding after loss can become a collective vow. A character returning to a place they once fled can become a vow to themselves. The language might change, but the structure remains familiar. A repeated choice becomes a promise, and eventually the story allows that promise to be recognized. This is why emotional payoff isn't limited purely to romantic arcs. It belongs to any relationship or internal journey where accumulated meaning finally becomes visible. A character forgiving themselves can be an emotional payoff. A soldier allowing rest can be an emotional payoff. A parent admitting fear can be an emotional payoff. A survivor accepting help can be an emotional payoff. The form changes depending on the story, but the craft principle remains the same. The payoff must reveal something the story has patiently prepared the reader to feel. Revising for emotional payoff, or editing if you prefer. When revising or editing for emotional payoff, it can be useful to read backward from the payoff scene rather than forward toward it. Identify the moment meant to evoke the emotional release, and then look earlier in the story for the foundations that make that release believable. Where has the bond been demonstrated? Where has the vow been lived before it was spoken? Where has the fear been allowed to exist? Where has the longing appeared in behavior rather than explanation? And where has the story shown the cost of remaining silent or finally speaking? This kind of revision often reveals that the payoff scene itself needs less work than its lead-up. The dialogue may already be strong. The emotional shape may already be correct. What may be missing is the pattern. A small earlier gesture, repeated once or twice in altered circumstances, may give the final scene far greater weight. A moment of restraint in an earlier chapter may help the reader to understand why the eventual confession even matters. A brief practical act of care may do more to prepare the emotional ground than a paragraph of explanation ever could. The goal is not to make every earlier scene point obviously toward this payoff. That can become kind of heavy-handed. The goal is to create an emotional trail that feels natural in retrospect. Readers should be able to look back and recognize the path without feeling that the story was underlining every single step. When done well, emotional payoff feels both surprising and still inevitable. The reader may not have known exactly how the moment would arrive, but once it does, they understand that it couldn't have meant anything else. Bringing it back to the heart of the story. At the center of emotional payoff is trust. The writer trusts the reader to remember. The reader trusts the story to honor what has been built. The characters trust one another enough to let hidden truths become visible. Every part of the exchange depends on accumulated faith. If the story has been honest, the payoff doesn't need to force itself. It can arrive quietly and still carry enormous weight. That may be the most important lesson to carry from this workshop. Emotional release doesn't require melodrama when the story has done the work of memory. Vows don't require grand language when behavior has already made them true. Intimacy doesn't require spectacle when the relationship has been built from precise, repeated acts of care. And the strongest emotional payoff often feels less like an explosion and more like a door opening onto a room the reader somehow already knew was there. As writers, we are not only constructing that door, we are building the house around it, slowly, patiently, room by room, until the moment of opening it feels inevitable. As you think about your own writing, you might quietly consider whether the characters have lived the emotional payoff you're working toward before they speak it. What repeated choices, small acts of care, or patterns of presence might help the reader recognize the truth of the moment before the characters finally name it. Part 5. This is our audience Q&A or guided discussion. This is the part of the workshop where I usually make a little more space for reflection, and I think that matters especially tonight because emotional payoff is not a craft topic that always benefits from immediate answers. Some subjects are easy to discuss. We can talk about pacing, structure, points of view, scene transitions, or conflict escalation, and often identify useful patterns right away. Emotional payoff tends to move differently. It often asks us to think about why certain moments mattered, why others didn't, and what kind of trust a story built within us before it asks us to feel something deeply. Those aren't always the questions we can answer the instant they are asked, and that's perfectly fine. If you're listening quietly tonight, you don't need to respond in chat. Sometimes simply letting a question sit in you for a while is the most honest form of engagement. One thing I would invite you to consider is the difference between an emotionally intense moment and an emotionally earned one. Many of us have read scenes that were clearly intended to be powerful. The music of the prose swelled, the dialogue reached for significance, and the characters said the things the plot had been moving toward. And yet, something about the moment didn't quite land. That experience can be frustrating, especially for writers, because it reminds us that sincerity is not the same as effectiveness. A writer can care deeply about a scene and still not have built enough structure beneath it for readers to share that level of care. At the same time, we have all probably encountered much smaller scenes that affected us far more than we expected. A character says something plain. Another character stays. Someone offers food, covers another person with a blanket, returns an old object, or chooses not to leave the room. The emotional force of those moments often comes from everything the story has taught us before we arrived. The moment itself might be small, but the memory beneath it is not. This is a useful way to think about our own writing because it shifts the question away from whether an emotional scene is large enough and toward whether the story has prepared the readers to understand that scene. When we ask whether a payoff works, we're really asking whether the reader has accumulated enough experience to feel that release. Has the bond been demonstrated before it's named? Has the absence been felt before the reunion actually arrives? Has the vow been lived before it's spoken aloud? And has the character's need been visible before the answer appears? These questions don't require immediate responses, but they can become very useful revision companions. They help us to look backward from the scene we want to matter and ask whether the road leading there has enough emotional texture to carry the weight. Another question worth sitting with is whether the emotional payoff in a story changes the future or only decorates the present. A scene may be beautifully written and deeply felt, but if nothing in the story is altered by the emotional truth being revealed, the moment can begin to feel ornamental. This doesn't mean that every confession or vow must immediately change the plot in an obvious way. Often the change is more intimate than that. The characters understand one another differently. A fear becomes speakable, a bond becomes acknowledged, a form of loyalty that has been implicit becomes explicit. From that point forward, future scenes must incorporate the knowledge revealed. If the story simply moves on as if nothing changed, the payoff may lose some of the structural force. Emotional truth becomes powerful when it continues exerting pressure after the scene ends. This is one of the reasons vows are such interesting storytelling tools. A vow creates an expectation. It asks the reader to remember. Once a character promises to remain, the story creates a new relationship between that character and every subsequent moment of absence, danger, or doubt. Once a character names love, the story has changed the emotional terms under which future choices will be read. Once a character accepts help, the story opens a new question about whether they can continue receiving care when it becomes difficult. These promises don't remove conflict, they reshape it. They create a new kind of tension because the bond is no longer merely implied. It's become part of the structure that the reader is now watching. In that sense, emotional payoff is not only a release, it is also a responsibility. For those of us writing long-form stories like myself, this can be both comforting and intimidating. It's comforting because we don't have to force everything into a single scene. We're allowed to build slowly, and we're allowed to let small moments matter, and to trust repetition, restraint, and gradual recognition. At the same time, it can feel intimidating because long-form emotional payoff asks us to remember what we've built. We have to remain attentive to the small promises our stories have already made, sometimes before we consciously understood that we were making them. A repeated gesture, a line of dialogue, an old absence, a shared object, a specific way one character notices another's pain, all of these things can become part of the emotional grammar of a story. When the payoff arrives, the story isn't only answering the plot, it is answering its own memory. I think this is a gentle reminder that not every emotional payoff needs to be perfectly polished in a first draft. Often the first draft of a scene simply shows us where the heart of the scene is. It reveals the confession we were writing toward, the vow we didn't know a character needed to speak, or the moment of tenderness that suddenly clarifies an entire relationship. Revision is where we can then go back and strengthen the path leading to that event. We can add echoes, deepen patterns, clarify absences, and allow earlier scenes to carry small pieces of the emotional truth that will later become visible. That kind of revision is not a failure. It's one of the great pleasures of long-form writing, and I'm actually doing a lot of that right now. The story teaches us what matters, and then we go back and hope the earlier chapters remember why. If you're thinking about your own project tonight, you might consider where your story is asking for emotional release. It may not be a romantic confession. It might not even be a vow in the formal sense. It may instead be a reconciliation, a moment of forgiveness, a character finally accepting rest, a mentor naming pride, a survivor accepting help, or someone admitting that they were afraid. The form matters less than the structure beneath it. What has the story been quietly preparing the reader to understand? What truth has existed in behavior before it becomes language? What small repeated act might become powerful if the reader sees it one more time at the right moment? That's the question I find myself returning to tonight. Not because not how do we make emotional moments bigger, but how do we make them more true? The answer usually lies less in heightening the payoff scene itself and more in honoring the relationship between that scene and everything that came before it. Stories become moving when they remember themselves. Characters become moving when their choices accumulate meaning, and vows become moving when they feel less like a sudden declaration and more like the natural name for something the reader has already witnessed. As we move toward our closing reflection tonight, you might quietly consider whether there is an emotional moment in your current work that you want readers to feel deeply. If there is, you might ask what the story has already done to earn that feeling, and what small earlier pattern might help the moment arrive with more truth when it finally does. Part 6. Closing reflection. The quiet work of earning an emotion. As we begin to close tonight, I find myself returning to an idea that has appeared in different forms throughout nearly every workshop that we have done together. Stories often feel as though they are made of big moments. We remember the rescues, the revelations, the battles, the confessions, and the scenes where everything finally changes. Those moments are important, of course, and there's nothing wrong with celebrating them. Yet the longer I spend writing and studying these stories, the more convinced I become that the moments we remember most are rarely carried by their own size. They're carried instead by the quiet work that came before these scenes. Emotional payoff is, in many ways, one of the most generous things a story can offer its readers because it rewards their attention. It rewards patience and memory, and it tells the reader that the small things did in fact matter after all. The conversation that seemed ordinary mattered. And I'm actually going to stop right there because we have an ad. I promise I am trying to pay attention to those. I'll be right back, my friends. I'm going to back up a couple of lines here. Emotional payoff is, in many ways, one of the most generous things a story can offer its readers because it rewards their attention, it rewards their patience, and it rewards their memory. It tells the reader that the small things mattered after all. The conversation that seemed ordinary, the object that kept appearing, the repeated gestures, the person who remained in the room, and the watch that was taken without complaint mattered. The meal that was prepared mattered, and the silence that seemed insignificant at the time did, in fact, matter. When the emotional payoff works, it creates a very particular feeling for the reader. It feels less like surprise and more like understanding, like something settling into place. We recognize a truth that the story has been quietly carrying for a long time. We suddenly understand why a character kept making that same choice, why someone kept returning, and why a particular absence hurts so much, or why a seemingly simple promise carries so much weight. The emotion arrives not because the scene is forcing us to feel something, but because the story has slowly taught us how to read its language. That, I think, is one of the most beautiful things that fiction can do. It can teach us to notice, to pay attention to things that seem small and discover that they're not, in fact, small at all. And perhaps that is why bonds and vows resonate so deeply in stories. At their heart, both are acts of continued attention, their choices repeated often enough that they become part of who someone is. A vow is not only a sentence spoken aloud, it's a pattern of behavior and a history of remaining. It is care made visible and loyalty given shape. The same is true of emotional payoff itself. The scene where the truth is finally spoken is only one part of that experience. The deeper truth is that the emotion was being built long before anyone said a word about it. As writers, this can be strangely comforting. It means that we don't have to force our stories toward emotional climaxes, we don't have to make every scene bigger than the one before it, and we don't have to demand that every chapter carry extraordinary intensity. That's frankly exhausting. Instead, we can trust accumulation, we can trust repetition, and we can trust patterns of care. We can trust the way meaning gathers quietly over time. Some of the strongest emotional moments in fiction are made of ordinary things that have simply become extraordinary through context. A hand on a shoulder, a chair moved closer to the bed, someone waiting outside a door, a promise to stay, a cup of tea, a blanket, or someone's name spoken softly. The objects themselves are simple, the history attached to them is not. And perhaps that is the lesson I would most want to carry forward from tonight's workshop. Emotional payoff is rarely about inventing a grand moment. More often, it's about recognizing the grandeur that has been quietly growing in ordinary moments the whole time. If you would like to take a small exercise with you this week, I'd invite you to look at one of the emotional scenes in your current project, particularly one that you hope will matter deeply to your readers. It doesn't have to be a confession or a romance scene. It could be a reconciliation, an apology, a moment of forgiveness, a mentor expressing pride, a character accepting help, or even a simple scene of rest after a long period of hardship. Once you've chosen the scene, don't begin by revising the scene itself. Instead, move backwards. Look through the chapters that lead toward it and ask yourself what the story has already done to earn that emotion. Where has the relationship been demonstrated? Where has trust been built? And where has care appeared in small ways? What repeated gestures exist between these characters? What memories, objects, places, or habits might carry meaning oh, sorry. Might carry meaning into the scene. You may discover that the emotional payoff is already stronger than you thought. Or you may discover that one or two small additions earlier in the story could dramatically deepen that final moment. Perhaps a repeated phrase needs to appear once more. Perhaps an old object needs to return. Perhaps a character needs one additional scene of quiet care. Or perhaps the story needs another opportunity to demonstrate presence. Try not to think of this exercise as adding emotion. Instead, think of it as strengthening the memory of the story. Because emotional payoff often lives inside memory. It lies in the reader's ability to look back and realize that the story has been preparing this moment for much longer than they knew. And if you're not actively writing now, that's perfectly alright. You can simply carry the question with you into the books, films, games, and stories that you encounter this week. Notice the moments that move you. Ask yourself why they worked. Ask yourself what came before, and ask yourself what small details made the larger emotion possible. Stories are generous teachers if you pay attention to them. I think there's something quietly hopeful about ending a workshop on bonds and vows. In many ways, these chapters remind us that some of the most meaningful things in stories aren't the dramatic victories or any grand revelations. They are the relationships that endure, the promises people choose to keep. They are acts of care that continue even when no one asks for recognition. Those things matter in fiction because, honestly, they matter in life. People remember those who remained. People remember those who listened. People remember those who kept showing up. And stories remember those things too. So wherever your own writing happens to be tonight, whether you're deep in revision, staring at a blank page, untangling a difficult chapter, or simply carrying ideas around in your head for a while, I hope you allow yourself a little patience. Because emotional payoff takes time. Trust takes time. Relationships take time. Some stories need multiple chapters before they're ready to speak their truths aloud. That doesn't mean the work is slow. It means the work is growing. As always, thank you for spending a little time here in the archives tonight. If you're heading off to write, I hope the words come easily. If you're heading to bed, I hope you find good rest. And if you're simply sitting with your thoughts for a while longer, I hope you carry something useful from our conversation into the week ahead. Take care of yourselves, drink some water, be sure to stretch if you've been sitting for too long like I have. Be kind to your mind if the words are difficult, and remember that quiet progress still counts. Thank you for spending time in the archives this evening. I'm actually going to go ahead and end there because, yeah, I'm having, it's been a challenging day. But I hope all of you have an awesome rest of your evening. Please take care of yourselves.